Hello and welcome to the Adventure Toolkit example reel number 10. My name is Glenn Storm and I'm from Hot Iron Productions. Today we're going to continue looking at tools from the event folder, starting with Input Relay. The Input Relay tool is meant to accept input from the user via keyboard or mouse or controller and relay that directly to objects in your trigger systems. Let's look at the properties. There's really only one. It's an array of inputs. And I've defined two that I want to use. The first property in these inputs is the button name, and this can either be the key that you want to press on the keyboard, or it can be the name of a button as defined in your project settings input. In other words, I can go to Edit, Project Settings, Input, and I'll see a number of axes and buttons defined. Any of the buttons, such as Fire 1 or Jump, can be used the same as keyboard input. Okay. In this case, I do want to use the keyboard button F. The next property to look at in inputs is Object to Activate. This is the object reference to activate once this key is pressed. The next property to look at is deactivate on release. And if this checkbox is checked, then the object that you've defined here will be deactivated once this key is released. In this case, I want to keep it on, so I don't care, so I'll leave that unchecked. The next property is first press only. So if by chance I have deactivated this object by some other means, and I continue to hit F, it won't matter as long as this checkbox is checked, because it's only going to consider the first press. The last property in inputs is Use Virtual Buttons, and if this is checked, it will use the pre-configured axes found in the Input Manager. Okay. I have two keys defined, F and D. They are set to fire the event single that we used in a previous example to fire this rocket. And I'm going to use D to activate this other trigger that will simply fire the second event, which will turn the particles off. So F to fire the rocket and D to delete the particles. Let's go ahead, let's hit play. And I'm going to hit F on my keyboard, and the event is fired, the mover's moving, particles particling, and I'm going to hit D, and that deletes the particles. Okay, that's Input Relay. Next, we're going to look at the Look At trigger. The Look At trigger is designed to detect whether or not the object is being looked at in a particular camera. So in this case, I've got a cube, and I want to know if it is within the view of a particular camera. In this case, a camera we used in an earlier example, Camera A from our Camera Manager demonstration. So let's look at the properties on the Look At trigger. First is the looker camera, and this is the camera reference that we are concerned with. It's Camera A. This Camera Manager is going to cut from A to B and back to A. And I want to know if this cube is going to be within the view of that camera. The next property is Use Angle Tolerance. And if this is checked, then this tool should consider the very next property called Angle Tolerance. If this is unchecked, then the tool will simply consider this object looked at if it falls anywhere within the viewport of that camera. Okay, even if it's just barely in the corner of the viewport, it'll consider it looked at. But if I've checked this property, Use Angle Tolerance, then it only considers our cube looked at if it falls within this angle tolerance. Now this is what angle tolerance means. Imagine from the center of your viewport there's a circle drawn at a particular angle. An angle of 30 degrees is something that looks kind of like this. It will just barely touch the top and bottom of our viewport in this sort of aspect, but it will not reach the edges, the corners and edges on the sides. So that's what I want to show in this example. So I've got angle tolerance checked and an angle tolerance of 30 degrees to configure. The last property on the look at trigger is activate on trigger, and this is the object to activate when it's considered that this object is being looked at by the camera in question. In this case, I have some look event particles that I would like to turn on our cube. So it's going to shower with particles as soon as it's considered looked at. Okay. Again, we're going to use camera A from an earlier example in order to do this. And what I've done is set up a mover for camera A to pan over slowly and eventually reach our angle tolerance and look more directly at our cube. To get this to work, I'm going to go ahead and put our mover reference on activate on cut. So it's going to cut to camera A and immediately fire our mover to pan over and look at our cube. And once it's within that angle tolerance, it will fire some particles. Let's go ahead and hit play and start our cinematic sequence. And once we pan over, it was within the angle tolerance and the particles fired, thanks to our look at trigger. It's important to note you don't actually need mesh components on your look at trigger object. It can be invisible. But this is useful for cases where you need to know, for example, did the player see a particular object or a particular character. Okay. That's all the time we have for this video. Please stay tuned for the next one.